enjoyed getting to meet the amazing people we're bringing to UNT to get to connect with all of you and share their experience. Today, in our final session, we will have Arthur Barrow, who is a UNT alum. And how many of you have known of Arthur or have had a chance to follow him in his musical trajectory? Yay! Awesome! So you have already some fans built into the audience. That's wonderful. And he's going to be giving a presentation today entitled From Scarface to Zappa, Insights into Success in the Music Business. I'm not sure how much time we'll have for Q&A, but we'll try to leave a little bit of time after your presentation.
Like 11:40 or something like
Maybe, that will be great. Whatever you feel like.
Okay.
And then you know how to reach him, follow him. He's very entrepreneurial, so you'll have a way to connect with him beyond today's session, which is always the goal, that you not only get to see and meet our presenters, but that you hopefully connect with them later on and establish some relationships and grow your own network as a result. So I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker for today, Arthur. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Fabiana for being nice enough to invite me. I'm here mostly in connection with Dr. Klein over here, who teaches the class on Frank Zappa, and who's invited me to be here and talk to his class on Monday. And going to put on a little concert right here in this hall today at 2, and I hope people can come to it. I understand the class has already gotten a lot of information about, using social media, etc., networking, and finding a need in your community and all that stuff. So I'm sure you've already got a lot of good information about that. But so I'm going to take hopefully a little bit different approach and just talk about my experience in almost 50 years as a professional musician. So that sort of chalked up a bunch of stuff. Thought I'd start by just talking a little bit about myself. Tell y'all a little bit myself. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, born and raised, and so I'm licensed to say y'all, which I think is, actually I think it's a good thing. I think the English language needs a plural for the word you, but I digress. I was born and raised in San Antonio. My father was not a professional musician, but he was a pretty good pianist and organist. In high school, I played electric guitar in rock bands in the 60s, and as a sophomore in high school, got my Stratocaster with a whammy bar, and it was a lot of fun to be playing music in the 1960s. There was so much great stuff coming out. I became a huge Jimi Hendrix fan. And then towards the end of my time in high school, my father had bought a Hammond organ, and I started playing some organ, and I just realized that I loved Bach a lot. Time to go to college, and I looked around. At first, I wanted to go to Austin. My sister had gone there because Austin was hip and groovy, and San Antonio was pretty out of it. And my dad was a real conservative Republican. He said, "You're not going there. They turn your sister into a communist. You're not going to do that to me." Of course, she ends up being a corporate lawyer, so she wasn't a communist. So I looked around. I came to North Texas. The big draw for me was a good music school, but specifically they had a great electronic music department. They had their labs with Moog synthesizers in them and all that stuff. And so I thought, oh, that sounds cool. I'd gotten very interested in synthesizers at that time. I thought they were just cool, sort of like being like an astronaut with all those controls and dials to play with. It was just very appealing to me. And so I got up to North Texas, auditioned on the organ, and I was not really very good, but I think barely good enough. I think the organ program needed students, so it's like, okay, you're in. And so it was pretty easy to get into school those days. And I got here and I discovered pretty soon that only composition majors at that time were allowed to go into the music labs and play with the Moogs. And I thought, well, I never thought anything about composing music, but what the heck. And so I declared myself a composition major, and then I was able to get into the labs, and I started learning. The first thing I taught was serial music, tone rows, and all that stuff. But soon I was able to, I became a teaching assistant, and so got my own keys to the labs and go in there with my friends late at night on the weekends and stay up late and fiddle with the Moogs. And so that was great fun. But I really, really loved my time here at University of North Texas. I actually was in TSU back then, North Texas State University. And it was just a great experience. I learned so much, and I was so so green when I got here. I had no exposure to jazz really at all. I remember being in the dorm room and sitting around hearing a bunch of guys talk about Miles this and Miles that, and I thought, who are they talking about? And I thought, well, they must talk about Buddy Miles, Jimi Hendrix's drummer, and then later on. I had never even heard of Miles Davis, so I had a lot of catching up to do and learning things, but it was just a wonderful experience. And also, during that time in high school and college here, I got more and more into Frank Zappa and saw him perform a few times, and just became like just a fanatic about him pretty much. And when I finished school, I said, I'm gonna move to Los Angeles and I'm gonna try to get in Frank Zappa's band. And my people, friends said, oh yeah, right, that's gonna happen. But I did, and I got lucky and at meeting people, and eventually, I moved there in '75. By '78, I auditioned for him and got in the band, and so that was pretty thrilling. I went from being just a nobody to playing big concerts with thousands of people, and people wanting my autograph and stuff like that. And it was quite an experience. So I want to just talk a little bit about, and then I've gone on and done other things, worked with other people, and I'm going to get to that. But I thought I'd talk about what being an entrepreneur means to me. I hadn't really given it a whole lot of thought until I was asked to do this, and so I've been thinking about it. And I think right off the bat, if you decide you're going to be a professional musician, you're an entrepreneur, because you're on your own. You're going to be self-employed, basically, at least to start with. And so I think of myself as my own cottage industry. And I think one really important point is that if you're going to do it, if you're going to try to be a professional musician, it's got to be your life. You have to be 100% dedicated to it. You have to devote yourself to it. Your girlfriend or your boyfriend is not going to like that, but it's going to lead to not much of a personal life. You've got to dedicate all of your effort to doing it, because if you don't, there's going to be 50 other people who will. And so if you have any chance at all, you've got to make it your entire life. I would also say you should always say yes to paying gigs. It was just part of the theme of my book, which, by the way, will be on sale. Entrepreneur that I am, I'm here hawking my book too. I would say always say yes to paying gigs, unless it's for neo-Nazis or something that you really can't stand. And another kind of thing, and this is pretty basic, but you should accept and learn from your failures. Failures, science guys will tell you, oh, failures are great because they teach you, okay, I thought it was going to be this, but it's not. So you will have failures, and that's just part of life. And another thing that, anyway, so you learn from failures and you forge ahead anyway. The Zappa was a great example of that. For every 20 ideas he had, these brilliant ideas, like maybe one of them would actually come to fruition and come to be something. And the other important thing you should know is you will get screwed. It's just going to happen. It's just part of the music business that's full of sleazy agents and managers and all kind of people. And so you just accept the fact that, from time to time, you're just going to get screwed. So you got to accept that. And I'd like to talk about some sort of basic things about being a musician and things that I think they should think about. Some of them are fairly basic, but if you're going to do this, you should, of course, master your instrument, and you should learn as many doubles as you can. If you're a woodwind player, you say, well, I'm a tenor player. Well, yeah, but you should also be able to play all the saxes and flute and clarinet, as many doubles as you can. I started off as a rock and roll guitar player and then started playing keyboards. And then in my later years here at North Texas, I picked up the bass, and so I had kind of a nice feel for it, and electric bass, and started playing bass, and I liked it so much I sort of declared myself that's my main instrument. But I also can play guitar and keyboards, and I've done all of those things throughout my career. And also, you should be able to read music. You should be a good sight reader. Even if you play guitar or drums or bass, you need to learn how to read music. I have several people that worked with over the years. Some, I have a studio, and sometimes I'll work with singers, songwriters, or whatever. And some guy will come in and he's pretty good, and it's pretty nice songs. And I'll say, so what's that chord there? And I don't have any idea. I don't know how to read or write music. If I'd studied theory, that might ruin my creativity. Like it did to Bach and Beethoven and Brahms and Stravinsky and any number of other successful people. So that's just stupid. For example, if you're playing a gig somewhere and somebody hears you and they say, "Wow, you're a really good guitar player, man. A session I'd like you to come play on. And but can you read music?" And you go, well, no. So why would you be that guy? You don't want to. You want to say yes. Yes, I can do it. And like I say, you want to expand yourself to as many things as you can to do. Like, for example, just not that long ago, I guess it was after 2009 when I came the first time for Joe's class, I had brought a bunch of charts that were just handwritten and they were kind of sloppy, and I got here and I was sort of embarrassed that I didn't have better charts for people. So that's when I got hold of the Sibelius notation program. There's some great software. Sibelius is one of them, Finale. There's others, I think, too. I just happened to use Sibelius and learned how to do it and worked on arranging skills, and now it's something I can do. Now I've expanded into somebody needs charts for something, they can come to me and I can write it out and make really nice looking charts. And it's also a good thing for me is that the older I get, the crappier my handwriting looks. And so it's great to have a program like that you can put out scores and parts that look like really legible. And I was fortunate enough to work with a woman named Liz Finch, who was a copyist in Hollywood, very successful, and works with orchestrators, and gave me a lot of tips about some basic things about that, like every page should have the title and the part name on it. So if your pages get all shuffled up, you can tell how they go together in the page numbers. So a lot of the basic stuff like that. So that's a good thing to expand to. And even if you don't consider yourself a composer or a writer, you should learn the craft anyway. You never know. You might be asked to co-write a song with somebody, like with Giorgio Moroder. I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. When he was working on Scarface, he was like working on all these things at the same time, and he'd come up with a piece. There was in film writing. There's two categories of music. There's the underscore, which is the dramatic stuff, and then there's what's called source music, which is if you turn on the radio in the car, it's what's coming out of the radio, or in this case, the disco, where Michelle Pfeiffer's doing her Ice Queen dance and looking real great. And so that's called source music. Joe told me there's some academic term for it now, but I don't. All I ever heard was source music and underscore. And Giorgio had come up with some songs for the disco scene, some brilliant things like Dance, 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 and I'm Hot Tonight. And he would come up with the title and the basic songs. I need some lyrics. Arturo, here, write some lyrics for this. Okay. So I came up with some lyrics, and now I get a few bucks whenever it's played, Scarface, and it turns out to be a good thing. And screen credit even. Another thing, you should master the written English language. And by the way, email is still a thing. It's not been replaced by texting. Texting is great. It's wonderful with your friends. It's also great for coordinating gigs and all that kind of stuff. And it's a great tool to have. But in the real world, in the business world, it's going to be email. So I did some work for NBC Universal last year, and it wasn't texting. It was with official emails that go back and forth. And you want to be able to express yourself in writing. You want to be able to make complete sentences, because your writing that you're going to put down in language it's going to express your thoughts and your organization of your thinking, and it's going to make an impression on people. If you write an email and it just looks amateurish and like somebody that really doesn't know what they're doing, that's going to count against you. So that is also very important. And besides, you might write a book someday. You know? It's going to be for sale. I'm an entrepreneur, you see. I didn't even know that. Oh, and you should always say yes. Did I mention that? Okay. And if you can afford it, I know it's so expensive now, but you get at least a bachelor's degree in music. At least that's what I did. And I'm so sorry that school's gotten so expensive now. You're probably going to gasp when I was here, started in 1971, tuition was about $200 a semester for a full load, and maybe $100 for books. So I'm so sorry it's gotten so expensive. And as far as they always say yes, I wanted to also mention that, like, for example, with this right now, I've not done a lot of lecturing, which may be obvious, I don't know, but I would like to hopefully do more. And so even now, I'm expanding what I can do by being able to talk like I am today to you guys, to y'all. Anyway, let me go on and give some examples of people that I've worked with. First, my biggest claim to fame is playing in Frank Zappa's band, and he was truly a great entrepreneur early on. He got himself on the Steve Allen show before he had the crazy hair and stuff, and got on there, if you know who the Steve Allen show was, the early TV show, and he went on there and he played a bicycle. He would like tap on it and with the drumsticks and do all kinds of stuff, but he managed to do that. Of course, he was always getting things done, and he even recorded a film score early on for a movie called Go Home Slow, and then he gradually became part of the LA avant-garde scene, and then eventually formed the Mothers of Invention, and talked a bunch of guys into playing his music, and he wrote all the music, and they were recording and gigging, and had a fan club, so he's like pushing it as hard as he can. And he was able to do something that at that time a lot of groups couldn't do. He actually made money touring. At that time, record sales were a thing, and the big bands, the Eagles and people like that, they really did the touring only to promote the records, and they might lose money on the tours. Frank figured out Frank didn't really sell a whole lot of records, relative to big bands like that. So he figured out a way to make money touring. He got his own PA and lights and toured with that. And we worked really hard. We'd play, 5 gigs a week, in different towns, for 3 or 4 or 5 months at a time. And as Frank mentions in 200 Motels, touring does make you crazy. It's an insane lifestyle. But it worked, and he managed to make money doing that. And then he, amazingly, when I first got in the band in 1978, even though he'd previous to that had actually a top 10 album with Warner Brothers, he was, pretty outspoken, and I don't think the record company executives were not that fond of him, because he wasn't like doing everything he possibly could to be commercial. He was, standing by his own goals and standards. So he's not too popular with those people. So when I got in the band, he had no record deal. He had no label. But so he threw it out, formed my own, and he forms his own record company, and it kept it going that way. I also recall that one of the things I want to point out, since if you really are sincere about something, you don't be afraid to borrow some money. I remember when the tours, I think it was maybe the first one, I don't know if it was the other ones, but I recall we'd like get checks on a certain bank account for a few weeks, and then it'll be on another bank account for a few weeks. I don't know whether he was getting loans from different banks or whatever, but he was doing whatever it was to float it to get the tour off the ground so he could actually start making money and have money come in when we actually got on the road. And also, I think an important thing with people like him is he knew how to delegate responsibility. For example, after my first semester, we call them semesters at Zappa University. After my second semester, the guy Ed Mann, who was doing the Clone-Meister job, and the Clone-Meister, he was the person who drilled the band when Frank wasn't there. They'd be long, like 8-hour rehearsals, and he wouldn't even be there for the first 4 hours. And so, whenever the band, the Clone-Meister, drill the band, or do it over and over and over until they're doing it right. And then Frank would come in. When he'd come there, and he'd start. Of course, he'd change everything. You know, it's like, oh, well, no, don't do it that way, do it this way. And as the Klangmeister, I had a tape recorder and record things and take notes, and then after the long rehearsal, I'd go home and, make all the notes about who was supposed to do what, and then you'd come back the next day and run through the song and say, wait, no, stop, remember, you were supposed to do that, and you were supposed to do, oh, right, and do it and drill it over and over until they were doing it the way you said to do it yesterday, and then you'd come in again and change it all again, So that's a little bit about Zappa. I could talk a lot more about him, but I want to move on to Giorgio Moroder. The title is Scarface to Zappa. And Giorgio Moroder, if you don't know who he was or is a producer, and he made a huge success and a ton of money in the, I guess, the late 70s. I don't know if you ever heard of Donna Summer. He wrote those things. He pretty much invented the Euro disco sound. And he was a guy who was willing to go into debt early on, too. He had an idea that he wanted to build his own studio and buy a Moog synthesizer and try to make a go of it with that. And he went to see some advisors, financial advisors, and told them his plan, and they said, no, that's not a good idea. You're going to just lose your... But he did it anyway. And so he formed this studio and plugged stuff in and started going digga 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 digga, and people loved it and became a huge hit. The guy wrote 11 #1 songs and has 3 Academy Awards, including Midnight Express, I don't know if you saw that movie, and Scarface, and also a best song from Top Gun called Take My Breath Away, which is one that I'm playing. Most of what you hear on there, besides the vocals, is me. But there was the disco era, and it went, and all of a sudden it just collapsed. And so he was sort of out of sight for a while. And then he had a surprise hit. He wrote a song called What a Feeling for a movie called Flashdance. And to everyone's surprise, it became a big hit. And so he's hot again, and he needed to hire people. That's how I found out about it. He hired me this time as a keyboard player. Synth player, because I knew about the synths and stuff, and later he discovered that I played bass, and so it was, oh great, you play bass too, oh put that funky slap bass on there, and all that kind of stuff. And again, he could delegate too, and he was a little different that way, like I said, he was Italian, and so his English wasn't very good. He'd just write the hook, usually, and then he'd have somebody else write the lyrics to finish the song. And so, as I mentioned, that's how I got to write some of the lyrics for some of those source music in Scarface. Giorgio was definitely an entrepreneur. Then I remembered I also worked with briefly with a guy named Malcolm McLaren. And Malcolm McLaren was he invented the Sex Pistols, and he was like a big part of the punk rock movement. Malcolm McLaren had a clothing store in London where he had sort of outrageous clothes, and he said, wow, if I had a band that would wear these clothes and look real shocking, then that would help promote my clothes line. And so, much like the Monkees were invented, the Sex Pistols were invented. They were basically a fake band, and their whole thing was they look outrageous and, wear safety pins in their cheeks or whatever they were doing, be as shocking as possible. And this was like a wet dream for the record companies, because it wasn't about the music, it was about the shock value. And it's like these guys could barely play, they'd just go into the studio, just record a bunch of stuff with, a bunch of energy, and it would, get a budget of like $15,000 and do that, and they'd sell a bunch of records. And then they'd say, hey, we're stars now. Of course, by the way, the record contracts are always, you're screwed right there, just on the record contract. And the record companies, they had to put out the money to do it. But this way, they could just make a real cheap record. These guys become stars, and they come back and say, hey, well, we're stars now. We need a better contract. And they say, well, yeah, sorry, bye-bye. We got a new group that's as shocking as you are, and we'll make another $15,000 album, and we'll make them stars. So anyway, Malcolm McLaren, I worked with him briefly, and it was just had some silly project. I was working with Keith Forsey, and I did some stuff for it. It wasn't a very good idea, I didn't think. But put in the time and sent in the bill, and he didn't pay, and didn't pay, and didn't pay, and I finally had to talk to producer Keith and say, this guy's not paying me. And finally had to twist his arm, and finally got paid. His whole thing was ripping people off. That was, his thing. His business was even called Swindle Inc. And it was really fun. So there's an example of a successful entrepreneur who was also a real jerk. He died not too long ago. And I also, I've worked a lot over the years with Robbie Krieger of The Doors. Anybody heard of The Doors? Hopefully you've heard of The Doors, maybe. Maybe not, I don't know, it was a long time ago, but they were a very successful rock band in the 60s. And so Robbie was over at my studio the other day. I told him, well, I'm going to do this entrepreneur class. I said, I don't really think of The Doors as entrepreneurs so much as this kind of lucky, magical thing that happened and was successful. And he said, well, he said, one important point that early on in the band, in The Doors, that they decided they were going to split everything evenly. All the writing of the songs, everybody was going to get credit, and that any decisions they made had to be unanimous. And Robbie says that it was Jim Morrison's idea to do this, and he said that Jim probably realized that that was probably the only way that he could get them to stick with it and stay with him, because Jim, he was, kind of a wild and crazy guy, to say the least. And so that's not exactly an entrepreneur thing, but it's, I think, an interesting point. I guess in conclusion, I'd say the important things are, 100% dedication to what you want to do, and always say yes. Always say yes. And I'll have some of these for sale if anybody's interested afterwards. And I guess that's pretty much what I got for now. Has anybody got any questions or anything? Would like to? Yeah.
How long were you in LA before you got the status of band, and what were you doing in between?
About 3 years. I moved from here to LA in '75, and by '78 I was in a band. That was a good question. It was a really great time to be there. It's like rents were cheap. I found a little bachelor apartment for $65 a month, and could you believe that apartment now would go for like $2,000, $2,500, like to get a room in somebody's house. It's so ridiculous. And I used to say, encourage young musicians. Hey, well, you're young. Well, come out to LA, give it a shot. You never know. Maybe you'll get paid sessions. Maybe you'll have a go of it. Now, I don't know. I can't really exactly say that to people because just finding a place to live just makes it nearly impossible. I'm lucky right now. We bought a house a few years ago, and my mortgage is very reasonable, so I'm able to sort of keep my head above water. And one thing, and I guess another thing I should say is, I've always, I've tried to keep my overhead low. I don't want to get too many monthly bills that I have to come, I have to pay every month. So I try to keep my overhead as low as I can and sort of help me survive the thinner times. But yeah, I played, you could play in top 40 bands. I got in a band and played high school dances and weddings and all that kind of stuff. And you could do it, so much like a lot of the stuff's been taken over by DJs now. But it was a viable thing. They had something called the Musician's Contact Service, where you can go there and with your notebook and look at some pages, just write down all this stuff of people who were looking for band members, which is actually how I originally got in touch with Don Preston, the keyboard player for the Mothers. He was, to my surprise, I called this guy named Bruce Powers about the band, and he said, and we have from the Mothers of Invention, Don Preston is gonna be in the band. I was kind of surprised. I was like, wow, he's in the Mothers of Invention, and he's at the same level I am. It was a little bit disturbing, but that's how I met Don Preston, and he just to go back to my little audition story again. He gave me Frank Zappa's phone number. I wrote it in my book. I said, wow, I got Frank Zappa's phone number, and I said, well, I wait till the right moment to call it, and then somebody I heard through the grapevine that, hey, Frank Zappa, he fired Terry Bozzio and Patrick O'Hearn, and he's looking for a new bass and drums. I said, well, this is my moment. So I called him up and told him on the phone that I'd learned the melody to Inca Roads on the bass as an exercise. And I think maybe he didn't believe me. And he said, well, St. Alfonso, Pancake Breakfast, you know that tune? I said, of course. And he said, well, the middle part that goes, he says, pick that off the record and learn that on the bass for and play or audition. And so I did, and he's heard me play it. He says, "Well, I hear a few wrong notes." My audition story, I probably told a million times. But, and so I got in the band, and needless to say, I was very happy.
Arthur, let me just interject. One of the things I think is really interesting, especially for this class, is how your first few years in LA, and this kind of gets to what Nick's question was, every connection you made had another connection, and kind of like the network kept growing.
Yeah,
You said you kept running into people in Zap Circle, but then you also met Robbie Krieger and all this. I think that's really fascinating how, in a short period of time, you kind of built that network. And you could kind of elaborate.
Yeah, and that in fact brings up back to the point of saying yes.
Right.
Not a particularly good keyboard player, but I don't know how it happened, but somebody I hooked up with some singer who wanted to audition for something, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll be your accompanist. And I went over to, I think it was at ABC Records over on Vine Street, and I'm there in the hallway sitting around waiting to do the audition, and I look over and I see somebody. I said, I think that's Ian Underwood, who was one of the musicians in the Mothers. And so I went and introduced myself and asked him if it was Ian Underwood. And here again, he's doing the same thing I am. He's Ian Underwood, and so just that saying yes thing to, yeah, I can do that, even if maybe I'm not so good at it, but just so, yeah, I'll do it. You say yes to doing so. And I worked with a woman named Sylvia St. James. Actually, I was in that same band with Don Preston, and she was a singer who'd worked with George Duke, sang on his recent album. And yeah, it was like this sort of circle of people. And through Don Preston, then I met the Fowlers, Bruce Fowler and Tom Fowler, and took some lessons from Tom, and soon put together a band called Loose Connection, a fusion band. We're playing my tunes and Don's tunes, and talked Bruce Fowler into doing it, which surprised me that he would say yes, but he did. He was smart. He said yes too. And did that for a while, and yeah, it just seems like I was sort of like as I was in orbit around the Zappa universe and finally got in. Yeah, so.
I have a question from a student who submitted it ahead of time, so I kind of want to make sure we get that answered. I don't know if he's here. David Lopez? Okay, cool. So David asks, while reading your biography on your website, it stated that you graduated from UNT in composition with a concentration in electronic music. My question for you is, what is your favorite thing about learning modular synthesis?
My favorite thing, all of it. But, it's just so cool. Like I say, felt like a mad scientist or an astronaut or something with all those knobs and dials. And the fun thing was, the modern stuff is fabulous, but with a modular synthesizer, you see, what would happen if I plugged this into that the wrong way? I'll get some weird sound and just experimenting and doing stuff. And, I love all the stuff that's around today, but it is kind of more fun to do stuff, the old, with the old analog stuff. And in fact, I'm not a person who gets rid of stuff. I was really sorry to hear that whenever it was, what year was it that the digital stuff started coming out, and they said, oh, we don't need all this old analog, all these Moogs, we'll sell them off for pennies on the dollar. It's like this a guy I know, Jim Ogilvy, bought them up, and he still has them as far as I know. And of course now they're worth a fortune, those modular Moog synthesizers. But it was just fun just to go in and fiddle with it and see what kind of weird sounds you could come up with. And back in those days, it was frowned upon to use the keyboard and play a melody or anything. You were supposed to just make eerie, weird, cool electronic sounds, which is what we did. Answer your question? Yeah.
Any other question?
Hey.
What do you guys?
Yeah. Can you talk about Frank Zappa's personality and what his work ethic was like as a composer? Also, what was your favorite track that you played on for Joe's Garage?
My favorite track that I played on Joe's Garage?
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, that's a good question. I mean, because I liked a lot of them. Maybe Packard Goose. Because I love the words. It was like him, talking about the music business, and how kind of screwed up it was, and with some funny words. Maybe you thought it was the Packard Goose or the Ronald McDonald of the Nouveau Abstruse. Well, call those people, I don't need no excuse for being what I am. And another thing is like he really didn't care for rock and roll journalists who were hard on him. They didn't like him much either. And he says, all those rock and roll writers with their pen in their hand, let me be more specific so they might understand. They can all kiss my ass, but because it's so grand, they're best to stay away. And so I like that. An interesting thing about that, as with so many songs, none of that was written out. In fact, in the entirety of the album of Joe's Garage, the only part that was written out was the middle section of Wet T-shirt contest. And he had a bunch of those. He called them insertion units, and that was number 3 or something. And he'd have us, work these up, little complicated, written out parts. And we just worked them up separately, and he says, I'll find a place to stick that later. And so then he wrote the Wet T-shirt song, which of course was based on true events that happened in Miami. A lot of things were based on things that actually happened. And then he sort of stuck that in the middle there. But aside from that, and he asked me to write out a lead sheet for Lucille's Messed My Mind Up from a tape. That was a Jeff Simmons song, I think. And we used that to record Lucille. But that's it. He would, like with Pack of Goose, he'd bring in a lyric sheet. It's just the words. And, you hear that there's like, if you divide it up, it's like, time signature. Just, maybe you thought it was with Pack of Goose, da, 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 or the rumble, the bump of the New York streets, da, 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 da. And he would just, he would just sing it, and we just follow the words. There was, and he'd, tell us, what he wanted us to play, but we didn't stop and think, well, this is a Barrow 3/8, and this is a Barrow 4/4, this is a Barrow 5/7, this is a quintuplet, this is a whatever. We just played it the way it sounded. And that happened a lot. And sometimes when I was Klonmeister, like with this tune we're going to play 13, later on today, it was this elaborate arrangement that he'd written. He originally had this just simple 13 lick that was a jam thing. And then later, when we went back to rehearsal, he elaborated on it and started writing more and more parts and more and more parts. And it sort of unfortunately, it kind of got lost in the shuffle and put by the wayside when, unfortunately, our drummer, Vinny, quit a few weeks before the tour, and there was a mad scramble to find another drummer. So a lot of this really interesting stuff he'd been working on, I'm not going to be able to play that. We're going to just focus on putting together one set of songs with the new drummer that would be viable, we could live. And that tour was a bit of a drag. Well, I wouldn't say it was a drag, but it was limited because we didn't have that much repertoire at that time. But of course, he kept writing songs as we went along. But that was true in a lot of the cases. There was just, in the case of an instrumental, like play his guitar, here, learn this, learn this, okay, now do this one twice, and then do this one here, and then do this one again, and put it all together, and all kind of metric modulations, and weird tuplets, and weird time signature changes, and I later went back and scratched my head and listened to it and figured out the best I could, how would I notate all that weird stuff? People have the impression, I think, a lot of times that, Mr. Zappa would go up on the mountain, as it were, and compose these beautiful creations and bring them back and, present those musicians to play it like machines, exactly as he'd written it. It wasn't that way at all. I mean, some tunes had charts, like something like Black Page or Moe's Vacation that he handed me, and Uncle Meat, things like that had written out parts. But more often than not, there weren't any parts. One of the tunes we're going to play this afternoon is Echidna's Arf. And I can tell by the way it lays on the guitar and just by the way it's assembled and put together that I'm like 95% sure that was just one of those pieces. It's like, here's a lick, learn this, now learn this lick, and put this together. I mean, we may have had some stuff written out for Ruth for certain sections. And I actually called Tom Fowler, who's a good friend. I'm friends with Tom and Walt and Bruce Fowler. And because Tom was in the band, and I asked him, I said, well, am I right? Is that how he did it? Was like a head chart? He says, well, I don't really remember. He says, but I don't remember seeing any charts for that one. So I feel maybe 99% sure that was one of those tunes. So it's interesting, and that's to be able to do that though. You've got to have a band that's quick enough on the tape that they can just do that. In that period where he was writing 13, right before Vinny quit, was just a very fertile time for him. He'd scaled the band down to where it was just Frank with the singers Ike Wilson, Ray White flanking him on the other side, and they played guitar and were great singers. And then the back row was the heavy artillery with Vinny Colaiuta on drums and Tommy Mars on one side of him and me on the other side. And I played bass and played some keyboards. Found out I played some keyboards too, so I did that on maybe 25% of the show at that time. But you could only do that because he had musicians that were talented enough and quick on the take. To be in that band, you had to be a walking musical encyclopedia. You had to be able to read music. You had to be able to play a bayer. You had to be able to, instantly, hear what he did and spit it back to him. One thing that happened to me that was kind of funny, he'd like show me a lick, and I was pretty quick. I could learn them fast. And, okay, yeah, I got it. Okay, that one. And then like an hour goes by and he shows you 10 other things, and then he says, okay, now remember that lick I showed you? And I go, what was it again? This one. Oh, right, yeah. And I found interestingly that that would happen until I slept on it. The next night, it was like as if it was going from RAM memory, just a random access that's in your brain, but overnight somehow your brain moves that into the long-term storage, the backup drive. So then I could easily access it once I'd slept on it. But I tell you a funny thing too. It's like those rehearsals; they were, really like 8 hours a day, and especially when he's like teaching you new stuff. And I learned a few years ago that when they study brains when people die, they say that every human brain looks the same, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a garbage man, or a gardener. They all look the same, except for classically trained musicians who seem to have grown an extra bit of the brain that links the right and the left hemispheres. And I can remember driving home from those rehearsals, those intense rehearsals, and I'd be driving home and it felt like my brain was spasming inside my skull. And I think that's what was going on. I think I was growing a new bridge in my brain. And I talked to Tommy Mars, who was the keyboard player, about it one time. He said, yeah, I thought the same thing happened to me. I'd be driving home and my brain's just like going spasming. It's a weird sensation to have your brain spasming inside of your head. But yeah, that's what seemed to happen.
We're out of time, but if we can give you a little overview of what's in your book, I think that would be great, so we can wrap it up.
Okay, well, of course I said yes, The Amazing Adventures of a Life in Music. And I basically talk about my life in music, some of the things I've told you, and a lot more. A lot of it's focused on Zappa. And I think it's a great read, and you should all immediately buy copies. Why? Because I'm an entrepreneur.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.